On 5 News, America lets loose over the collapse of the Syrian ceasefire. It's blamed Russia for the deadly attack on this aid convoy, but Russia insists it wasn't responsible. Also, the teenage boy who died after glaring failures at his psychiatric hospital. 15-year-old Chris Brennan had a history of self-harm, but staff had no proper plan to deal with it. Today, Chris's mum tells us he was simply neglected.
It seems that like he was left in a corner and forgotten about.
Cut down on antibiotics, the landmark global plan to tackle superbugs. And is body art a barrier to employment? How bosses are missing out by turning away candidates with tattoos. Hello and welcome to 5 News. I'm Sian Williams. The future of Syria is hanging by a thread. That's according to the US Secretary of State John Kerry, who was addressing the UN Security Council this afternoon. America blames Russia for the deadly attack on an aid convoy near the city of Aleppo. Russia strongly denies it. Mr. Kerry says listening to their foreign minister made him feel like he was in a parallel universe. Our political editor, Andy Bell, reports.
Who bombed this convoy? The Russians, who released these drone pictures, say it wasn't them, even though they also say that is a military vehicle towing a mortar next to the trucks. No matter, as far as the Americans are concerned, either the Russians or their allies, the Syrian government, committed what could be a war crime. At the UN today, as the Russians called for an investigation, the Americans had clearly decided enough was enough and that repeated ceasefire violations had to stop.
That's an international agreement. 4 times arrived at, 4 times. Countries have said, we will do this. And 4 times, it's been shredded.
This was all that was left of that convoy, attacked on Monday night on the way to Aleppo. In the last few hours, 4 staff have been killed in another attack, this time at a medical centre. Just a few days ago, a ceasefire had been in place, agreed by the Americans and the Russians. We spoke this morning to one Aleppo resident. That was either a rocket or an incoming artillery shell. So does he have any hope of a negotiated settlement?
We don't expect this. Yes, we are going to. Now we are living in a war that we expect it will, expand for many years coming, because no one have a movement to stop this killing, to stop this kind of crimes.
After so much destruction, there's precious little trust on the ground, but analysts believe Russia and America have to cooperate.
The brutal fact is that if things in Syria are to be gotten under control, then somehow or other the United States and Russia are going to have to cooperate closely together to impose their will on the ground and to get things under control.
How are you? Nice to see you.
The Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson has met his Russian counterpart for the first time and has urged him to go back to talks to keep the ceasefire alive. That may seem almost impossible, but there is simply no alternative.
Andy, let's just go back to that very strong language by the US Secretary of State John Kerry today to the UN Security Council. Does it mark a change in America's approach to Syria?
Well, John Kerry today said this amounted to a moment of truth for Syria, and with his Russian opposite number, Sergei Lavrov, sitting just a few yards away, he said basically to the Russians, look, you have to get the Syrian government under control. If it wasn't you who bombed that convoy, it was the Syrian government, but they did it essentially with you allowing them to do it. And he said people like Assad and also rebels like the Al-Nusra Front and like so-called Islamic State, these are people who don't want there to be a ceasefire or who don't want there to be peace in Syria. He said, so it's up to people like us and you, the Russians, to ensure that, in your case, the Syrian government does move towards having a ceasefire. Now, Boris Johnson, the Foreign Secretary, in the last few minutes has come out and said basically the same thing, saying that the Syrian government, and he said, and their sponsors, he was very diplomatic. This is the new Boris Johnson at work here, very diplomatic, saying we will simply refer to them as their sponsors, i.e. the Russians. They have to be brought to the position whereby they go back to the negotiating table and we have a ceasefire. And it does feel as if the Americans are trying to use these incidents, these violations of the ceasefire to try and see if they can really shift the whole nature of this conflict and get it back to the table and get it back to some sort of negotiated settlement.
Andy, thank you. Resistance to antibiotics is being described as the greatest future threat to our civilization. That's by England's Chief Medical Officer, Dame Sally Davis. The UK has led a drive to raise global awareness of the threat posed by them, and today 193 countries signed a landmark declaration agreeing to combat it. Health leaders warn that if antibiotics lose their effectiveness, then everyday procedures that we take for granted, like caesarean sections and joint replacements, could become too dangerous to perform. Simon Vigard reports.
The food we eat can be full of antibiotics, and so can we after a visit to the doctor. It means our very civilization is under threat. That's the stark warning in a landmark declaration from the United Nations on antibiotics and superbugs. This accelerated footage from a giant Petri dish shows bacteria mutating and repeatedly overcoming increasing doses of penicillin. Massive doses simply overwhelmed by a superbug. Britain leads the way on the fight back as the UN places it in the same bracket as HIV and Ebola.
This has killed far more than Ebola has, and is set to be one of the biggest killers as we go forward. At the moment, across the world, 700,000 people a year die of drug-resistant infections, of which a third are small babies.
The United Nations declaration means all countries will have to develop regulations to control sales, to launch education programmes on how to prevent superbugs, and to encourage new ways to develop antibiotics.
If we don't, as a society, use antibiotics appropriately, this is something that's going to hit all of us, and the public have got a role to play in addressing this problem.
At St George's, University of London, they are on the front line of all of this, developing resistance breakers to work side by side with the antibiotics. So what about the predictions of millions of deaths?
I mean, there was a civilization before antibiotics, but it was more uncomfortable, there were more deaths, and it was impossible to do the sort of things we do now in modern medicine. So I don't think it's the end of civilization, but I do think it's the end of modern medicine as we know it, if we don't do something about it.
Antibiotics were once seen as the magic bullet, but our over-reliance on them has put us in a very precarious place. Simon Vigard, 5 News.
At least 29 people have drowned after a migrant boat capsized off the Egyptian coast. It's thought the vessel was carrying around 600 passengers and was on its way to Italy. The UK's decision to leave the EU has had little impact on the country's economy so far, so says the Office for National Statistics. It comes as an organisation representing dozens of countries, the OECD, raised its growth forecast for the British economy just months after warning it would suffer an immediate shock following the Brexit vote. The Prime Minister, Theresa May, says she won't allow an industry of vexatious allegations against British troops over claims of abuse in Iraq. The Iraq Historic Allegations Team has recently been criticised for its handling of cases. Ms May says steps are being taken to tackle any abuse of the system. In the United States, violent clashes have broken out between police and protesters in North Carolina after the fatal shooting of a black man there. 43-year-old Keith Lamont Scott was killed by officers who claim he was carrying a gun. His family and eyewitnesses insist he was unarmed. Julian Drucker has more.
Another of the protests which appear to be increasing in frequency and intensity. Demonstrators left the streets, then blocked this crucial highway in Charlotte, North Carolina. There, the authorities used tear gas to try to control the fractious situation. But the anger only exploded. This police car was vandalised. 12 police officers were injured. As once again, at the heart of the unrest, the suggestion that there's a disregard in America for black lives.
When I see this, I'm thinking any given moment I get pulled over or stopped or a cop comes, it's likely I'm gonna get shot, armed or not. I'm gonna get shot. It's been growing. People getting shot everywhere, man. So if you're a black guy, you probably should be scared.
In the last 24 hours, Keith Lamont Scott was shot by police and died in hospital. The officers who found him insist he was carrying a gun.
They respond, they confront the subject as they engage him. He is armed with a handgun that we found on scene as well. Makes some imminent threat to them, and because of that, at least one of our officers fired.
Live on Facebook, Mr. Scott's daughter documented the moments after her father's death. She disagreed with the police's version of events.
Hey, my daddy ain't had no gun.
As police in Oklahoma continue to investigate the shooting 5 days ago of an unarmed man, this latest incident has reignited the issue of race and the allegations of racism. Julian Drucker, 5 News.
And still to come on the programme. Tackling homophobia in football, why some fans still have a problem with players being gay. And how much does this harm your chances of getting a job? All that and more after the break. Hello and welcome back. You're watching 5 News. Last night, we told you about the shocking lapses in care for people with mental health problems which may have contributed to their early deaths. Tonight, a new and tragic example. 15-year-old Chris Brennan, described by his family as funny, kind and caring, took his own life while being looked after in one of England's largest mental health trusts. Chris repeatedly harmed himself at London's Bethlem Royal. The coroner said he'd been neglected and that staff were desensitised to the number of self-harm incidents at the hospital. Our health correspondent Catherine Jones reports.
Chris Brennan was 15 when he died. He'd begun to struggle with his mental health 6 months before, and on several occasions he'd swallowed small objects, so he'd been admitted to this adolescent mental health unit in South London.
It was hard to keep him safe at home. We were struggling. We got some help, but it wasn't quite enough. And we thought that would be the best place to keep him safe.
But things got worse rather than better, and on the 31st of August 2014, Chris attempted to swallow the top of a deodorant bottle. He then pushed a panic alarm, but staff were unable to save him from asphyxiating.
Even though Chris had been here for 5 weeks, no risk assessment document and no care plan had been drawn up for him. At his inquest today, the coroner described a unit struggling to cope and staff desensitised to children harming themselves. She concluded that Chris's actions followed cumulative and continuing failures, and neglect did contribute to his death.
They seemed as they couldn't be bothered with him. To be perfectly honest, you hear all too often about the most vulnerable in society, but surely a child with mental illness, they must be the most vulnerable, and he never got a care or.
He was let down in so many ways.
But by the hospital, when they should have been doing it, they never.
The South London and Maudsley NHS Trust says, "We offer our sincere apologies to Christopher's family for their loss. Areas of learning for the Trust were identified and we have carefully reviewed our procedures accordingly. We hope this offers some reassurance to the family that lessons have been learnt." John and Kelly are now supporting a call for an independent inquiry into the deaths of children in mental health settings.
It's heartbreaking hearing of other children going through the same things.
I think it's been a shock to find out how many as well.
Shouldn't have to be that way, should it?
No.
It shouldn't have to be that way, Cathy, but what do parents want to see from this inquiry?
Well, John and Kelly are supporting the charity Inquest, who want to see an independent inquiry because they say even the most basic information about these deaths of children in mental health circumstances aren't being collated. They believe there have been 11 deaths over the last 5 years of children in mental health settings, but they can't even be sure of the number because the way the data is collected doesn't even classify whether the person is under 18 or not. That's as basic as it gets. So this amplifies completely everything that we reported on yesterday, showing that concerns about lessons being learned aren't being spread across the NHS as they should be.
Catherine, thank you. The ballot in Labour's leadership contest has now closed. Jeremy Corbyn faces a challenge from his rival Owen Smith. Mr Corbyn is the favourite to hold on to the leadership when the result is announced on Saturday. Almost 3/4 of British football fans have heard homophobic abuse at a match. That's according to the charity Stonewall. Their study also suggests young people are twice as likely to be embarrassed if their favourite player came out as gay. No current Premier League football players are openly gay. Peter Lane reports.
The dangers of and damage done by homophobia are taught in class here at the Manchester Communication Academy. But pupils are already well aware that when it comes to our national sport, football, such prejudice is still very real.
Having this patriotic sport with complete focus around men, I'm sadly not surprised about it.
There's still a lot of people who still don't accept gays and lesbians.
When a high-profile football comes out, it'll be normalised very easily in media as well as in general day-to-day life.
Big clubs and big names are doing their bit with campaigns like this.
I can't change, I look like Lewis Hamilton.
I can't change that my hair is perfecto.
But those Stonewall figures on fans' experience of homophobia and how they feel about players coming out speak for themselves.
Players are lacing up to kick homophobia out of football. Use #rainbow laces to...
Justin Fashanu was the only top-flight British footballer to come out back in 1990. He later took his own life. Ex-Leeds winger Robbie Rogers came out, but only after moving back to America. And former Aston Villa and Germany midfielder Thomas Hitzelsperger waited until he retired before coming out. For openly gay Olympic athlete Tom Bosworth, who proposed to his partner in Rio, football needs to catch up.
It would be an absolutely huge moment for football, for especially in England, a Premier League footballer to come out and speak publicly about their own sexuality, or even just live openly.
For these young players, it wouldn't be a problem.
I wouldn't mind. I just want to see the football.
I don't know how people's sexuality has anything to do with it.
And that attitude is the goal, but football isn't there yet. Peter Lane, 5 News.
Finally, they've long been regarded as a barrier to getting a job, but now a conciliation service says employers shouldn't judge candidates on their tattoos. ACAS has warned companies they're missing out on hiring talented workers because of negative attitudes towards body art. Minnie Stevenson's been finding out more.
There is often no going back, yet around 1 in 5 of us in Britain have a tattoo. But do you need to think before you ink? A report's revealed that workplaces across the UK could be missing out on hiring talented young people because of old school attitudes towards tattoos. Take 26-year-old Brogan Flight, going under the needle today for tattoo number 2, but her day job in insurance means she'll still be reining in her rebellious side.
It's very brave having your tattoo done while on the news, but you're going to get one of your tattoos removed, aren't you? And why is that?
I am. I've got a dragonfly on my wrist, and it was a good idea when I was 21, at uni, enjoying myself. Now I've got a professional job. The more you go up the career ladder, it's sort of less professional and it's less acceptable.
So while tattoos in the UK may be going up in the style stakes for some, will your career prospects go down?
Avoid the hands, avoid the neck and face if you can. What you're having done might offend some people. Little dolphins or love hearts or something are fairly safe. I think something slightly more sinister like a gun or whatever might have a different effect.
Of course, tattoos haven't held back some of Britain's most high-profile people. Among the inked and famous, recently Dame Judi Dench got her first tattoo on her 81st birthday. Carpe diem, seize the day in Latin. While Samantha Cameron may no longer be at number 10, a subtle dolphin on her ankle is more permanent. Question Time presenter David Dimbleby decided 75 was the perfect time to get a scorpion on his back. And some pub quiz trivia for you. Did you know even Winston Churchill had an anchor tattoo on his arm? Tattoo artist Nick Skunks has been inking the rich and famous for over 30 years and told me the tattoo taboo is somewhat fading.
I've tattooed MPs, lawyers, doctors, members of bands, footballers, and I think from that, you know, it's become very much more acceptable. I think obviously out there people will still judge, but I think people are lightening up to the fact and actually judging people by their attributes rather than their physical appearance.
Regretful tattoos may be one thing, but the report asks employers not to make snap judgments about permanent body art. The consequences could be painful. Minnie Stevenson, 5 News.
Ouch, that looked like it hurt. Matt's here to tell us what's coming up on 5 News tonight.
You look like you've been to the dentist, actually. Thanks, Sean. Yeah, I'll be talking to actually one of the world's top tattooists about that story. Mickey Violetto has a policy of not tattooing hands or faces, and he talks to young people when they come into his parlour about the potential effects of getting a tattoo. We'll hear from him about their growing popularity and reactions to them as well, and also a remarkable story of one very brave young woman. Adele Bellis was scarred for life when her ex-boyfriend arranged for her to be attacked with acid. I'll be talking to her about how she's now using her experiences as a force for good at 6:30.
Good for her. Thanks, Matt. See you later on. That is it for us, though. Sean Welby has the weather next. I'll see you again tomorrow at 5. Thanks for watching tonight. Goodbye for now.